Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to analyze Hollywood and whether the entertainment industry has been giving us an honest portrayal of race relations in America. My guest today is Dr. Justin Gomer. Dr. Gomer is an assistant professor in the American Studies program. Welcome, Justin, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start the conversation on a high note and a note of recent accomplishment, and that is the fact that the movie Moonlight just won the Best Picture Oscar Award. And is this a landmark achievement for this film and for the industry, and if so, why?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is. I think Moonlight winning the Academy Award for Best Picture marks the first time that Hollywood has given the Best Picture Award to a movie that we would categorize as a queer black film. And in that sense, it is a movie about things that are not typically put on camera, and certainly not done so with the artistic skill that was done in Moonlight.
All right, well, we're going to have you play film critic here for a moment, because a lot of our members in the audience probably haven't seen the film, and so provide us, if you would, with a brief synopsis of the film and why you think that it was more worthy or more deserving of the Best Picture Oscar Award than the film La La Land, which had all of the publicity going in.
Yeah, so Moonlight is a story about a young African-American child named Chiron, and it is a coming-of-age story, a classic coming-of-age story. And Chiron grows up in the Liberty City neighborhood of Miami, and he's sort of coming to grips with his life and his sexuality throughout the film, and that's what the film essentially is. It's a rather sort of simple premise, but what makes it superior to La La Land, in my estimation, is both the skill to which it's executed and also the content and the story that it tells. So for me, the director, Barry Jenkins, the way that the film is shot, the way that it's put together using different characters to play the same character at different points in his life, was really the most interesting, best bit of filmmaking by far of the year. I think on top of that, what you also get with Moonlight then is a story that doesn't typically appear on screen, and that is of a young, poor black child coming to grips with the fact that he is gay and wondering what that means for him, for the people around him, and what his sexuality will mean for the rest of his life. And so in that sense, I think what Moonlight gives you was not only the best bit of filmmaking, but using all of the skills of director Barry Jenkins to apply it to a story that isn't typically told in Hollywood.
And do you think that, considering that the main characters are black, that this is an acknowledgement that the industry is going to be more involved in celebrating black cinema than it has in the past?
I certainly hope so. I think this year we're coming off of the Oscars So White controversy, where we had a few years there where there were not a single black actor nominated in any of the acting categories. And so for optimists, I think the Moonlight's victory at the Oscars is hope that Hollywood might begin to do some very different things when it comes to the volume and the content of its representations of African Americans.
Well, let's go back in history about 50 years to a famous film known as Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Mm-hmm. This was very popular back in 1967, 50 years ago, and it starred Sidney Poitier, of course, and Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, and it tried to deal with an issue of interracial marriage, which at that time, we have to remember, it was illegal in about roughly 16 states, largely in the South, in terms of interracial marriage. So this film, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, tried to deal with that issue of interracial marriage at a time when the Supreme Court was considering dealing with those laws. What do you think of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Was it a film that was able to achieve the goals that they were trying to achieve with that film?
Yeah, I think that's really well put. I think it achieved the goals that Hollywood was trying to achieve with that film, which was to show through not Sidney Poitier's role as Dr. John Prentice, not just in that film, but Sidney Poitier's roles throughout the 50s and 60s. These images of immaculate, highly educated, perfectly dressed, incredibly eloquent, black characters, and Sidney Poitier is the best person in every film that he ever appears in. And so I think that was very much part of Hollywood's idea of showing the worthiness of African Americans of respect and civil rights through showing a character that could not be critiqued in any way. I think in terms of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, what you have then is sort of the embodiment or the culmination of that with this version of you have the first interracial kiss, and you get the story of Hollywood really saying interracial marriage should be okay. We shouldn't really have a problem with this. I think the issue with Guess Who's Coming to Dinner for a lot of black thinkers and critics and activists of the time was that by 1967, when the film was released, black social activism had largely moved from the civil rights to the Black Power movement. So 1967 is 2 years after the Voting Rights Act, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act. It's 2 years after the Watts Uprising. It's 6 months after the Newark and Detroit Uprising. And so a lot of the activism within black communities had moved to Black Power, which called for very different sorts of analysis in political organizations. And so, as James Baldwin famously said about the movie in a magazine article that he wrote in 1968, about Sidney Poitier, he said, with Sidney Poitier, white Americans appear to be under the compulsion to dream, whereas black Americans are under the compulsion to awaken.
And if we talk about Sidney Poitier, we know that the 60s were quite a banner time for him. He was in a number of films, and as you alluded to, he was typically the best dressed, the most eloquent, perhaps even the best educated person or character in that film. And we have to look at that from an honest perspective in terms of looking back.
Yeah.
Should we at least give Hollywood some credit for trying to portray a positive black character and an eloquent black character?
Yeah, so I think that was very much Hollywood moving away from what it had done in the decades since before the 1950s and the 1960s, which was representing African Americans largely as these sort of buffoonish, ugly, asexual, and undesirable characters in any such way. So what you get with Poitier is very much a counter to what Hollywood had done in the decades before then. I think what ends up happening is that in terms of Sidney Poitier's roles and Hollywood's ability to speak to the needs and concerns and desires of black civil rights activists, it was somewhat limited in that regard. And so I think it's sort of a mixed bag on if you're analyzing Hollywood moving away from what it had done in the past versus are you analyzing Hollywood in terms of how capable is it of speaking to pressing civil rights issues. And I think exactly what you alluded to is that Sidney Poitier were the positive representations to counter the negative ones in Hollywood, when the reality of life and activism and civil rights is a lot more kind of nuanced and complex than getting rid of positive or negative characters and replacing them with positive ones.
Okay, well, let's move forward into the 1970s. And as we got into the 1970s, there had been a number of social upheavals. You've mentioned a few of them. And then there was also Watergate, which also had quite an impact on the culture and society. And so filmmaking took a turn. Characters were starting to get more realistic, a lot more gritty is the term we often use.
Yeah.
And if you look at Al Pacino in Serpico, or Clint Eastwood in Dirty Harry, or Gene Hackman in The French Connection. These characters are almost anti-hero heroes in a way.
Yeah.
And also on the other side of cinema, there was an effort to bring in black characters that were more urban and more hip, more in keeping with the times, at least from the costuming and the characterization that Hollywood thought was appropriate. And then that led to this era known as blaxploitation with Superfly and Shaft and a number of others. What about that? Why did blaxploitation become so popular, and what was the purpose of it?
So I think there's a number of things that lead to the blaxploitation, the brief blaxploitation era in the 1970s, from 71 till about 75. One is that Hollywood is in really bad economic shape when you get to the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. And so as a result, it's far more willing to make different kinds of film than it was in the decades before the 1960s and 70s. You get the collapse of the Hollywood classical studio system, the collapse of the production code that really regulated what you could and couldn't do on movies. And also Hollywood doesn't have a lot of money, so they're looking for new kinds of movies that are low budget. And so one of the things you get are all these sort of gritty movies, as you allude to. And what Hollywood does is it's sort of seeing that audiences are wearing thin-on Sidney Poitier characters. You also get this independent movie made by Melvin Van Peebles in 1971 that sort of represented some of the early themes that would get picked up in blaxploitation. And then Hollywood sees that and says, oh, there's our next move. And so it makes Shaft and Superfly and 60 to 100, depending on how you categorize the genre, blaxploitation films. I think what it found is that black audiences very quickly got tired of those representations as well, for a variety of reasons.
Well, and also during the 70s, we had a television miniseries called Roots, which became very popular. And at the time, it was a story that was very compelling. And to be honest, a lot of white people hadn't really thought about the history of slavery and slaves individually and the family roots. What about that? Was that a bright spot in the entertainment industry?
Yeah, and I think one of the things to remember with Roots, and this is, there's a scholar named Matt Jacobson that has done a lot of kind of work on this phenomenon, is that part of the reason why Roots became as big as it did is it's not only offering sort of a new take on the sort of African American experience or the African diaspora experience, but it really resonated with emerging sentiments within the nation about different sort of changing ideas of our origin story as a nation. And so what Matt Jacobson talks about is that this was a period in which we imagined ourselves as a nation that wasn't founded on Plymouth Rock, but was founded in Ellis Island. And so what you had is a lot of communities, a lot of across sort of racial lines, starting to look towards their own ethnic origin. So this is where, identities of being, I'm not just a white American, I'm an Irish American, right? And so there was a lot of that emerging sentiment. And I think Roots really picked up on that, talking specifically about slavery and African Americans, but also it sort of resonated with larger audiences who could sort of trace their immigrant past through Ellis Island. And so I think that sort of dynamic is what accounted for a lot of the sort of widespread appeal and interest in Roots.
Well, if we talk about stereotypes in cinema, certainly the blaxploitation films developed a certain kind of stereotype.
Yes.
We were just talking about that. As we moved into the 80s, we just have about 45 seconds before we go to the break.
Yeah.
We saw a turn in the 80s, especially in the late 80s. What was that turn in the late 80s?
Yeah, so in the late 80s, Hollywood really rediscovers what I would call black freedom struggles, the struggle for the abolition of slavery and the civil rights movement. And so on the heels of the Reagan presidency, you get a number of films like Glory, that's dealing with the Civil War, films like Mississippi Burning and The Long Walk Home that are dealing with the civil rights movement. And that sort of was a new era of Hollywood looking at civil rights again, for the first time really since the 1960s.
Okay, and on that note, we're going to go to the break and we'll continue this conversation when we come back. Stay tuned. We'll continue our journey through Hollywood and its portrayal of race relations in America. Stay with us.
With a degree in film and electronic arts, you can design sound for film. Remember Jaws, Jurassic Park, Darth Vader in Star Wars? Or you can direct, write, edit, or supervise for cinematography for films like Casablanca, Pulp Fiction, the Batman series. Hollywood can be the playground of your creation. You can become a part of this exciting career field with a degree from Cal State Long Beach.
Hello and welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly and my guest today is Dr. Justin Gomer. And Justin, before we went to the break, we were talking about the late 1980s and some of the films that came out at that time. There was another film that came out directed by Spike Lee called Do the Right Thing. How did Do the Right Thing enter into that mix of filmmaking of the late 80s?
Yeah, so I mean, I happen to think Do the Right Thing is the best film of the 1980s. And I think what you have with Do the Right Thing is a movie that is very much trying to be in dialogue or to challenge a lot of what Hollywood's doing at the same time. So those movies we talked about earlier, like Glory, The Long Walk Home, Mississippi Burning, those were movies about key moments in black freedom struggles that imagined a white colorblind hero at the center of the push for racial justice. And they're essentially fictional accounts, right? They're not based on much of any of the historical record. And so I think one of the things that's very important about Do the Right Thing is that, for me, is Spike Lee saying, well, Hollywood's interested in imagining this colorblind past that the historical record doesn't support. Spike Lee's going to say, I want to talk about right now. What's going on right now in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn? And I think his whole a lot of his filmmaking in that era is really very much tailored to counter what Hollywood's doing. And I think it's no mistake that in the early 90s, 93, he makes Malcolm X, which is his version of saying, okay, Hollywood's interested in talking about the 1960s with all of these civil rights dramas that imagine this colorblind white hero. I'll give you a 1960s movie, but we're going to talk about Malcolm X.
And I think another factor is at play here when we talk about Hollywood in general and the entertainment industry. After all, it is an industry.
Right.
It's a money-making industry, and the first goal of Hollywood is always to make money. And that being the case, we know that oftentimes drama is based on these sort of mythical stereotypes. Heroes and villains and good triumphing over evil and so forth. And if we want to make money, we're going to go for the most dramatic and the most sensational and the proven plot lines that are going to bring in the money. And so are we asking too much of Hollywood to be socially relevant all of the time when their main goal is to make money?
Yeah, I think that the way that I think about that is not necessarily to wonder what Hollywood should or should not do or what's its responsibility to social causes or not, but I think it's to ask questions about the films that it does produce. And within that structure that you sort of outlined, that it is trying to make money by appealing to these mythical ideas of good triumphing over evil, why, since the 1960s, have American audiences found these fictional historical dramas about white colorblind heroes far more entertaining than actual stories of black heroism or interracial organizing or however you want to imagine that? And so I think for me that becomes the real question. It is about appealing to what audiences want. It is about driving audiences into theaters. But why then are it certain stories around civil rights that aren't supported by the historical record the ones that tend to be the most popular? And by that I mean ones that sort of imagine a colorblind white heroism that isn't really there in the historical record of the civil rights movement.
And I think it goes to the idea that we want to identify with our own heroes, and we want to assume that those that came before us, no matter what racial background they're from, were heroic in some way. And so the white folks watching movies want to see heroic white people.
Right.
And we talked about this before we came on the set, about the fact that we see some of this in war movies as well, that you know, we all can acknowledge that war is hell.
Right.
And there are atrocities generally on both sides in the war theater. But when you see a Hollywood version of war in the movie, you know, the Americans are usually always the good guys, or the allies are the good guys, and the atrocities generally tend to come from the other side.
Yeah.
And so how do we correlate that with what we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're exactly right, that what movies made about the past are not really about the past at all. They're about the present. They're about imagining, looking to the past to make sense of the present, and imagining who we would be if we were in that moment. And I think in terms of, for example, civil rights dramas, what Hollywood's version of the civil rights movement has shown us is that it's very interested in sort of satisfying this white liberal desire of what would I have done in that moment? And I would have stood up against inequality, I would have stood up against injustice, and that these movies sort of give me representations of who I would have been. But I think what that also shows us is that Hollywood is more interested in catering to that sentiment than it is to speaking directly to the lives, concerns, and anxieties of African Americans. And I think that that then just speaks to Hollywood's limitations throughout its history of really, like I said, speaking to to black communities and to black audiences, because it's concerned with those other things that you alluded to.
Well, let's talk about a film like Beverly Hills Cop with Eddie Murphy. Came out, I think it was 1984. Yeah. Very successful film. It spawned several sequels. His character is very likable. The stories are funny. They're entertaining. Audiences love the show, love the program because it's a popcorn movie. But yet it's not particularly socially relevant. Is there anything wrong with that?
No, I like Eddie Murphy a lot. I like Beverly Hills Cop a lot. And I think that what you have is that you have a wide spectrum of the ways in which Hollywood sees itself making money, right? And I think comedy, popcorn movies, as you say, is a real key part of that. I think for me, what remains fascinating is that there seems to be a reliable, almost annual way that a story that Hollywood will turn to, because it knows that it will have an audience that will always go out for a civil rights drama. It always has an audience that will go out for a movie about slavery if those movies are made in a particular kind of way, with some of those themes and ideas that we talked about earlier.
And if we talk about mainstream Hollywood, has mainstream Hollywood underestimated society's ability in general to tolerate more complex interracial themes?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's underestimated or overestimated mainstream America's ability to kind of deal with these themes. I think what it certainly has done is that Hollywood has played a fundamental role in shaping the way that we think about race. Right? So our kind of larger societal attitudes or discourses or ideologies of how we think about race, racial inequality, injustice along racial lines, that part of those attitudes are fundamentally shaped by Hollywood, particularly what Hollywood has done in the decades since the 1960s. So that's sort of the framework that I like to stay with. It's not, to me, it's not so much whether or not Hollywood's underestimating or what they're sort of imagining audiences want or not. It's that those representations then become foundational in the way that we think about and view race in our larger world outside of the movie theater.
Okay, and we have a number of more recent films like Crash, for example, The Help, Selma,
Right.
12 Years a Slave. It seems like Hollywood is at least making an effort to try to deal with some of these historical incidents or some of the things that are going on in society. Is Hollywood doing a better job than they were maybe 10 or 20 years ago in this?
I think the four films you mention give you the entire spectrum of the good, the bad, and the ugly of how Hollywood is dealing with race in its current moment. And if I, just to touch on each one briefly, I think Crash was director Paul Haggis's attempt to really push the boundaries and expose the inadequacy of Hollywood's ability to deal with race. I think it was largely a failure in that regard, because Crash for me is a movie that really doesn't deal with racism more so than it deals with bigotry. So in Crash, everyone is a bigot, everyone says really awful things to each other, but it sort of divorces the issue of racism entirely from questions of power, so that we can call each other mean names and we're both affected by and guilty of bigotry, when that is part of what racism is, but it's not the entirety of it. I think The Help gives you the classic 1980s and 1990s fictional civil rights dramas of white colorblind heroes at the center of civil rights struggle that are entirely fictional. And I think the last two films you mentioned are two of the most important. Selma, which to me is Ava DuVernay's attempt to not only give us the first King biopic, but to contest Hollywood's version of the civil rights movement. So it's very important to me that that is a movie that is about Selma, not Birmingham, for example, because Selma is after King delivers the I Have a Dream speech. It's after he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, when he takes on a very different sort of attitude in his speeches and his organizing that is sort of incommensurate with what Hollywood had represented as the colorblind ethos at the center of the civil rights movement. And lastly, I think same thing, 12 Years a Slave is Steve McQueen basically saying Hollywood has really done a poor job representing slavery with any sort of accuracy, and that to me is a far better in every sort of sense of the word representation of the institution of slavery, and a far better movie, quite frankly.
And we've been talking about Hollywood as its one monolithic sort of structure,
right, yeah.
And that's clearly not
right.
what's really going on today. Maybe in the old era of the studio system,
right.
we could talk
yeah.
in those terms, but
right.
there's so many independent producers now, and there are numerous film festivals
right.
and opportunities for distribution. So given that that's the case, aren't we in an era now where things can be done that wouldn't have been done, 30, 40, 50 years ago?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot, there's a lot more. There's a lot, especially with the collapse of the classical Hollywood studio system, and more recently with the rise of companies like Amazon and Netflix putting out their own movies now, and all of the different production and distribution companies that you mentioned. I think that is reason for optimism, that you're going to start to see different kinds of movies get made, that you're going to see audiences sort of sought out for different kinds of movies. And I think Moonlight is a real example of that. a movie that classical Hollywood or even Hollywood from 10, 20 years ago would not have had the interest nor really the capabilities in their business structure to really distribute, that now in this kind of era with all of these sort of small distribution companies, Moonlight, a film made for I think only about $1 million, can find a distributor, find its way into film festivals, and eventually, win the Best Picture Oscar. So I think that is a really good element of the business model of Hollywood, is that it's so sort of diffuse that there's a lot of opportunities for different kinds of movies to get made that wouldn't have in the classical era, for example.
And the knock on Hollywood has always been that all films have to have the quote-unquote Hollywood ending,
Yeah.
which is the happy ending,
Yeah.
which is what audiences tend to enjoy that.
Right.
Foreign film is different.
Yeah.
If people watch foreign films, they see that things don't wrap up quite
Right.
so nicely, and we don't always walk away happy.
Yeah.
What about that in Hollywood? Are films today more willing to look at less of the traditional Hollywood ending and more of the sort of, life is complicated type of ending?
Yeah. I think that it sort of depends on the film, it depends on the filmmaker, it depends on the year. I think with all of the different ways that people are making movies now, all the different companies, you're getting more of everything, right? So you're getting more of the cliche Hollywood ending, what sort of social conflict, for example, can't be solved through a marriage, right? And so, but then you're also getting different sorts of endings. And I think if we look at Hollywood in the period since the 1960s in particular, the filmmakers that we identify as the iconic best filmmakers, the Francis Ford Coppolas, the Martin Scorseses, and so forth, they are filmmakers who have drawn their influence not just from Hollywood itself and classical Hollywood, but from a larger sort of conception of what we might call art film, which has a longer lineages in countries like France, Japan, Italy, and so forth.
Well, on that note, we've run out of time, unfortunately, but I want to thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on this edition of Talking Points. Join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.